In 1956, the United Kingdom faced a decision that would reshape its role in the world economy. The Suez Canal, a narrow waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, had been under British and French control for decades. It was one of the most strategic shipping routes on Earth, carrying two-thirds of Europe's oil supply and serving as the primary link between Britain and its remaining colonial territories in Asia. On July 26th of that year, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. The canal would no longer be operated by foreign shareholders. It would belong to Egypt. For Britain, this was seen as both an economic threat and a challenge to its international standing. Prime Minister Anthony Eden viewed Nasser's move as unacceptable. He believed that allowing Egypt to control the canal would undermine Britain's influence and disrupt global trade. What followed was not a sudden crisis, but a series of calculated decisions made over several months. Eden's government began planning a military response. The goal was to retake the canal by force, restore foreign control, and demonstrate that Britain remained a global power. France, which also held financial interests in the canal, agreed to join the operation. Israel, facing its own tensions with Egypt, became the third participant in what would be a coordinated invasion. The plan was presented as a peacekeeping mission. Israel would attack Egyptian positions in the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then intervene, claiming they needed to separate the two sides and protect the canal. In reality, the invasion had been arranged in secret weeks earlier. On October 29th, Israeli forces moved into Sinai. 2 days later, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields. At first, the military operation proceeded as expected. Egyptian forces were quickly overwhelmed. British paratroopers secured key positions along the canal. Within days, the invasion appeared to be succeeding. But the political reaction was immediate and severe. The United States, which had not been informed of the plan, condemned the invasion. President Dwight Eisenhower viewed the action as a dangerous escalation that could push Egypt toward the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. The American response was not limited to words. The U.S. government began applying economic pressure. Britain's currency, the pound sterling, came under intense strain as international confidence collapsed. The Bank of England's reserves dropped rapidly. The United States refused to provide financial support unless British forces withdrew from Egypt. Britain also faced the possibility of being cut off from American oil supplies, which were critical as the Suez Canal remained closed. Within the British government, divisions emerged. The Treasury warned that the country could not sustain the financial costs of continuing the operation. International opinion had turned sharply against the invasion. The United Nations passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. Even within Britain, public support began to fracture as the true nature of the conspiracy became clear. On November 6th, less than a week after the bombing began, Britain agreed to a ceasefire. By December, British and French forces had withdrawn completely. The canal remained under Egyptian control. Nasser, rather than being weakened, emerged with his position strengthened. The operation that was meant to restore British influence had achieved the opposite. The financial costs were significant and immediate. Britain's economy, already strained by post-war reconstruction, suffered a loss of confidence that took years to recover. The pound was devalued. Trade relationships were damaged. But the deeper cost was strategic. The Suez Crisis marked the end of Britain's ability to act independently as a global power. It demonstrated that British foreign policy now depended on American approval and support. Historians suggest that Eden and his advisors misjudged the international climate. They believed the world would accept military intervention, as it had in earlier decades. They underestimated how much the global order had shifted since the end of World War II. Colonialism was no longer seen as legitimate. International institutions like the United Nations carried more weight than before. And most critically, they failed to anticipate that the United States would prioritize Cold War stability over supporting its traditional ally. Records indicate that Eden was aware of the risks. but believed the operation could be completed quickly enough to avoid serious consequences. He saw Nasser as a threat comparable to the dictators Britain had faced in the 1930s, and feared that inaction would be seen as appeasement. This framing led him to discount warnings from advisors who questioned whether military force was appropriate or sustainable. The decision was not the result of a single miscalculation, but a series of assumptions that reinforced each other. British leaders assumed their experience gave them superior judgment. They assumed their historical role entitled them to act. They assumed the costs could be managed. Each assumption, in isolation, seemed reasonable. Together, they created a plan disconnected from the reality of 1956. The canal itself was never the real issue. Egypt operated it successfully after nationalization, and international shipping continued without major disruption. What Britain lost was not access to the waterway, but credibility, financial stability, and the illusion that it could still shape world events through unilateral action. The Suez Crisis became a reference point for understanding the limits of military intervention and the importance of aligning policy with economic capacity. It showed how quickly a nation's position could change when it misjudged its own strength and the willingness of others to support its decisions. The mistake was not in valuing the canal, but in believing that the world of 1956 would respond as it had in 1906. For Britain, the consequences unfolded over years. The crisis accelerated the process of decolonization as the costs of maintaining distant territories became unsustainable. It shifted the balance of power within the Western alliance, making clear that the United States, not Britain, would lead. And it forced a re-evaluation of national priorities, away from global intervention and toward regional partnerships, most notably with Europe. The financial cost could be measured in currency reserves and trade deficits. But the strategic cost was measured in influence that could not be reclaimed. The decision to invade Suez was made with confidence in Britain's continued importance. The withdrawal, forced by economic reality and international pressure, revealed how quickly that confidence had become outdated. What seemed reversible in October had become permanent by December.